The first thing that disappeared wasn't a city. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't even a signal. It was time. At 9:14 Universal Time Coordinated, every clock on Earth, atomic, digital, biological, stopped agreeing with itself. Satellites drifted a fraction out of sync. Heart monitors skipped half beats. Entire data centers flagged cascading errors they could not explain. For exactly 3 seconds, humanity lost its grip on the one constant it had always trusted. And then the sky changed. Not with fire. Not with fleets blotting out the sun. There were no cinematic shadows, no roaring engines, no declarations echoing across the void. Instead, something far more unsettling unfolded: precision. The kind of precision that felt less like an attack and more like a correction. Orbital platforms went dark first. No explosions, no debris, just silence. Thousands of human-made machines, representing decades of engineering brilliance, ceased transmitting at the same instant, as if someone had reached into space and flipped a single invisible switch. On the ground, power grids followed. Entire continents dimmed in perfect sequence, not chaotically but deliberately, like lights being turned off room by room. And still, no panic broadcast. That was what the watchers noticed. Across the galaxy, in observatories buried in asteroid belts and stations orbiting distant stars, dozens of civilizations had already been observing Earth. Some out of curiosity, others out of quiet concern. Humanity was unusual, fast-growing, unpredictable, difficult to model. A statistical anomaly in a universe that preferred patterns. So when the coalition finally acted, they expected noise. They expected resistance. They expected humanity to scream. But Earth did none of those things. No distress signals were sent. No emergency transmissions flooded subspace channels. No desperate pleas for help echoed into the dark. Even military frequencies, normally chaotic in crisis, remained eerily disciplined, then abruptly still. It was as if 8 billion people had collectively decided to hold their breath. On the coalition flagship, a being whose species had never once miscalculated in its 12,000-year history stared at the data with something dangerously close to uncertainty. Their projections had been flawless. Humanity, left unchecked, would become uncontrollable within 2 generations. Preemptive neutralization was the logical solution. And yet this was not how prey behaved. Confirm planetary status, the commander instructed. The answer came back instantly. Earth is intact. Infrastructure disabled. No active resistance. Pause. No casualties detected. That was the first fracture in their certainty. Because if this was an attack, it was incomplete. And if it was a warning, it was excessive. It occupied a space between categories, a surgical suppression without destruction. On Earth, cities stood untouched. Buildings remained whole. Oceans were calm. Skies were clear. But nothing moved the way it should. No aircraft. No satellites. No global network. Civilization had not been erased. It had been paused. Deep beneath the surface, far below any structure visible from orbit, something else stirred. Not violently. Not urgently. But with intent. Unseen by the coalition. Unmeasured by their instruments. Because for the first time since they began observing humanity, their models returned a result they had never encountered before. No prediction available. And as the silence stretched past its first minute, then its second, then its third, a far more dangerous question began to form. If humanity wasn't reacting, then what exactly were they doing instead? For the first hour, the coalition waited. Not out of caution implied uncertainty, but out of protocol. Every operation, no matter how decisive, followed a sequence. Observation. Verification. Stabilization. It had been that way for thousands of cycles, across hundreds of civilizations, and it had never failed. Until now it seemed incomplete. From orbit, Earth remained a quiet sphere of blue and white, unmarred by the kind of devastation the galaxy associated with conquest. The suppression field, an intricate lattice of quantum interference, continued to function perfectly, dampening every known form of communication, energy transmission, and coordinated signal across the planet. It was a masterpiece of control. Nothing escaped it. And yet, nothing emerged from it either. No secondary response detected, one analyst reported, its voice flat with precision. No adaptive behavior, another added. The commander did not respond immediately. It studied the incoming streams of data, not for what was present but for what was missing. Human behavior, even under extreme duress, followed patterns: fragmentation, panic, resistance pockets, irrational escalation. Those patterns had been cataloged, simulated, predicted. But here, there was only stillness. "Deploy observation probes," the commander finally said. Within minutes, a network of autonomous devices descended through Earth's upper atmosphere. They did not announce themselves. They did not disturb the environment. Each probe was designed to watch, to record, to understand. They slipped into cities, hovered above oceans, drifted through abandoned airspace. What they found made even the machines hesitate. Humans were moving. Not chaotically. Not desperately. But with an eerie, coordinated calm that defied every model the coalition had built. In hospitals, doctors continued working without digital assistance, reverting to methods centuries old. In cities, civilians walked, not ran, toward designated gathering points that had not been broadcast through any known channel. No one shouted. No one broadcast. No one tried to reach beyond the planet. It was as if they already knew communication would fail, and had planned for it. "Impossible," one analyst muttered, breaking its own standard of emotional neutrality. Because this wasn't adaptation. This was preparation. Across the galaxy, other civilizations began to tune in more closely. At first, it was curiosity. Humanity had always been a subject of quiet interest, a species that progressed too quickly, innovated too unpredictably, survived conditions that should have broken them. Now it was something else. The Kavari Syndicate, masters of predictive economics, ran a full-spectrum simulation of Earth's situation. The result returned in less than a second. Outcome: collapse inevitable. Timeline: 11.3 days. They archived it and moved on. The Elthari observers, ancient beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires long before humanity discovered fire, recorded the silence without comment. To them this was familiar. Civilizations ended. It was the natural order. But even they noted one anomaly. Behavioral deviation exceeds extinction threshold. They did not elaborate. Back on Earth, the probes continued their silent watch. They recorded every movement, every pattern, every deviation from expectation. And slowly something began to emerge, not in what humans were doing but in how consistently they were doing it. There were no outliers. No fractures. 8 billion individuals, stripped of their technology, their networks, their global systems, were acting as if they were still connected. The coalition ran deeper scans. Subsurface mapping. Thermal imaging. Quantum resonance sweeps. That was when they found it. At first, it looked like noise. Minor fluctuations beneath Earth's crust, too uniform to be natural, too subtle to trigger alarms. But as the data accumulated, the pattern became undeniable. Something beneath the planet was active. Not localized. Not isolated. Planet-wide. Unknown infrastructure detected. The system flagged. The commander leaned forward slightly, an almost imperceptible motion for a being that rarely moved at all. Define unknown. There was a pause, an actual delay in response. Structure does not match any recorded human engineering signature. That should not have been possible. Every known human system, from the smallest circuit to the largest orbital construct, had been mapped, analyzed, and categorized. The coalition did not overlook details. It did not miss variables. And yet this did not fit. "Expand scan depth," the commander ordered. The probes complied, pushing their sensors further, deeper, beyond the thresholds normally required for observation. Data poured in, layer upon layer of readings that began to form something coherent. A network. Massive. Interconnected. And already active before the suppression began. Which meant only one thing. It hadn't been built in response to the attack. It had been waiting for it. For the first time since the operation began, the coalition adjusted its internal assessment. Humanity was not reacting. Humanity was executing. And somewhere beneath a silent, powerless world, something far larger than survival had already begun. The first probe vanished without warning. One moment it was transmitting, steady, precise, feeding the coalition a continuous stream of environmental data from deep within Earth's mantle. The next it was gone. No signal loss. No damage report. No interference spike. Just absence. At first, the system flagged it as a malfunction. Probes failed. Even perfect machines encountered variables. The coalition had accounted for that. Then a second probe disappeared. Then a third. Each loss occurred deeper than the last, at layers where human activity should have been impossible. The coalition recalibrated instantly, deploying redundancy protocols, widening scan frequencies, increasing resolution. Nothing explained the losses. There were no energy surges, no detectable weapons, no measurable disruption. It was as if the probes were being erased. Confirm environmental hostility, the commander ordered. Negative, came the reply. No hostile signatures detected. That answer lingered longer than it should have, because something was clearly wrong. Above the surface, Earth remained unchanged. Cities functioned in a strange, stripped-down rhythm. Without satellites or digital infrastructure, humanity had reverted, but not regressed. Movements were purposeful. Logistics were precise. Supply chains, thought to be severed, were somehow still functioning at a reduced but stable level. There was no chaos. There was no fragmentation. There was only control. And that, more than anything, unsettled the observers. Run behavioral divergence analysis, the commander instructed. The results came back with an anomaly rating beyond measurable thresholds. Humanity, under total suppression, was behaving with a level of unity no species had ever achieved, even under ideal conditions. No communication. No centralized command visible. And yet no deviation. It suggested something impossible. Either humanity had solved coordination without communication, or they were still communicating in a way the coalition could not detect. That possibility was dismissed almost immediately. It had to be. Because if it were true, it meant the suppression field, the most advanced system ever created, was incomplete. And the coalition did not make incomplete systems. Deep beneath the crust, the scans intensified. Layer by layer, the structure became clearer, not visually but conceptually. It wasn't a single installation. It wasn't a facility or a weapon or a network in any conventional sense. It was something else. A pattern embedded into the planet itself. Every continent, every tectonic boundary, every major geological structure, connected. Not through cables or tunnels or machinery, but through something that behaved like synchronization. A resonance that moved through the Earth as if the planet itself had been repurposed. Energy readings increasing, one analyst reported. Source. Undefined. That word was beginning to appear too often. Across the galaxy, observers began to shift from passive monitoring to active analysis. The Kavari Syndicate reopened their archive simulation, running new variables through their predictive models. The result changed. Outcome, unknown. Timeline, indeterminate. They ran it again. Same result. That had never happened before. In a distant observatory, an L3 entity focused its attention more intently than it had in centuries. It had seen civilizations rise from nothing and collapse into silence. It had studied patterns across epochs, mapped the life cycle of intelligence itself. This did not fit any pattern. This is not survival behavior, it transmitted quietly to its kind. This is transformation. Back in orbit, the coalition escalated its scan depth to maximum threshold. That was when the distortion began. It wasn't dramatic. There were no violent fluctuations, no catastrophic failures. Just inconsistencies. Sensor readings that did not align with physical reality. Time stamps that drifted out of sequence by fractions of a second. Then by whole seconds. Inside the flagship, a synchronization alarm triggered. For 0.7 seconds, the ship's internal systems disagreed on what time it was. The error corrected instantly. Systems recalibrated. Stability returned. But the damage was done. Because the only source of that distortion was below. From Earth. Confirmed temporal interference, the commander said, its voice quieter now, not uncertain but more focused. Confirmed, came the response. Localized. Expanding. That should not have been possible. Time was not something that could be manipulated on a planetary scale. Not without energy signatures that would rival stellar phenomena. Not without technology that surpassed even the coalition's most advanced constructs. And humanity was not supposed to be capable of that. Another probe descended, this one reinforced, shielded, designed to withstand conditions far beyond Earth's environment. It pushed deeper than any before it, transmitting continuously as it went. For a moment, everything was stable. Then the feed changed. Not cut. Not lost. Changed. The data began to loop, but not perfectly. Each repetition was slightly different, as if the probe was experiencing the same moment multiple times, each with a minor variation. Coordinates shifted. Energy readings fluctuated. Time stamps overlapped. And then, just before the signal vanished, a single line of corrupted data resolved into something coherent. Not a system message. Not an error. A pattern. Deliberate. The analyst froze as it translated. 3 words. Not broadcast. Not transmitted. Embedded. We adapted first. Silence fell across the flagship, not imposed this time but chosen. Because for the first time since the operation began, the coalition was no longer observing a suppressed civilization. It was observing something that had already moved beyond them. And whatever was happening beneath that quiet, powerless world, it was no longer staying contained. The first system to fail was not near Earth. It was 3 sectors away. A coalition navigation hub, one of the most stable, redundant infrastructures ever constructed, began returning incorrect coordinates. Not wildly inaccurate, not catastrophically broken, but subtly wrong. Ships exiting faster than light travel arrived fractions of a second early or late. Distances shifted by margins too small to trigger alarms, yet large enough to compound into navigational drift. At first it was dismissed as calibration error. Then a second hub reported the same issue. Then a third. Within hours, the coalition's most reliable travel routes, corridors that had remained unchanged for centuries, began to destabilize. Ships slowed. Traffic rerouted. Entire fleets paused mid-transit, awaiting recalibration that never fully resolved. And still, no hostile force was detected. No external interference, the systems confirmed. Source? The commander asked. Unknown. That word again. Across the network, communication relays started experiencing delays. Messages arrived intact but out of order. Commands reached fleet seconds too late. Data packets overlapped, duplicated, or vanished entirely before reappearing in fragments. It wasn't jamming. It wasn't hacking. It was something worse. The structure of communication itself was slipping. Run full-spectrum integrity diagnostics, the commander ordered. The results came back fragmented. Not corrupted, fragmented. As if the system itself could no longer maintain a consistent version of reality long enough to report on it. In distant observation posts, other civilizations began to notice the same phenomenon. Trade routes faltered. Long-range sensors lost precision. Even localized systems, isolated from coalition infrastructure, reported minor temporal inconsistencies. At first they blamed the coalition. Then they realized the pattern. Every disruption traced back in some way to one point. The realization spread slowly, like a ripple moving through still water. The planet that had been silenced was now affecting everything around it. Back on the flagship, the commander reviewed the latest data in complete stillness. The suppression field remained active. Earth's surface still showed no signs of technological reactivation. No transmissions. No launches. No visible resistance. And yet the effects were undeniable. Correlation threshold exceeded, an analyst stated. All anomalies align with expanding influence radius centered on Sol. Define influence, the commander replied. There was a pause. Unable to quantify. That was no longer acceptable. Prepare containment protocols, the commander ordered. For the first time since the operation began, the coalition shifted from observation to intervention. A perimeter was established around the solar system, layered, reinforced, designed to isolate whatever was happening within. Additional suppression arrays were deployed, amplifying the original field, tightening control over every measurable variable. If Earth was the source, then Earth would be contained. The systems activated flawlessly. For exactly 12 seconds. Then they failed. Not violently. Not catastrophically. They simply stopped applying. Energy flowed. Commands executed. Systems reported full functionality. But the effect was gone. As if the universe itself had decided not to listen. Explain, the commander demanded. No failure detected, the system responded. Then why is containment not active? No answer came. Because there was none. Across the galaxy, the consequences accelerated. A coalition fleet attempting to reposition near the outer rim emerged from transit in the wrong system entirely, one that did not exist in any current star map. Their sensors confirmed stellar bodies that had no recorded history, no catalog entries, no prior observation. They had not been redirected. They had arrived somewhere new. Panic, for the first time in thousands of years, began to surface. Not openly, not chaotically, but in subtle fractures. Delayed responses. Hesitation in command chains. Questions that did not receive immediate answers. The coalition's greatest strength had always been certainty. And certainty was beginning to erode. Back at Earth, the silence remained. No ships launched. No signals escaped. No visible change broke the stillness of the planet. But beneath that surface, the resonance had intensified. It pulsed now, not rhythmically, not predictably, but with a growing complexity that defied measurement. The planet was no longer just a source. It was becoming a center. A point from which the rules themselves seemed to bend. The commander issued a final directive. Re-evaluate threat classification. The system processed the request, pulling from every database, every model, every recorded precedent. For a moment it hesitated. Then it returned a result that had never appeared in coalition history. Threat level, undefined. The commander stared at the classification, unmoving. Because undefined did not mean unknown. It meant unbounded. And as another report came in, this one confirming that multiple coalition outposts had begun experiencing localized reality drift, the implication became unavoidable. This was no longer about Earth. Whatever humanity had started was no longer staying within their system. And for the first time since the coalition began its campaign, a possibility emerged that had never needed to be considered before. What if containment was no longer an option? The message did not arrive. It appeared. No transmission spike preceded it. No carrier signal, no encoded frequency, no detectable origin point. One moment, coalition systems were struggling to maintain internal consistency, and the next, every display across every network in every controlled system simply changed. Data streams paused. Command interfaces froze. Navigation overlays dissolved into static. And then, in perfect clarity, a single line replaced everything else. Can you still see us? For a fraction of a second, no one responded, not because they chose not to, but because the question itself disrupted something deeper than protocol. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a demand. It was a test. And no one knew how to answer it. Trace source, the commander ordered immediately. The system complied, deploying every available method of origin detection. Quantum backtracking, temporal mapping, signal reconstruction. The result returned instantly. Source none. That was impossible. Every message had an origin. Every signal existed within a chain of cause and effect. Even anomalies could be traced back to a disruption point. This had no chain. Simply was. Across the galaxy, observers stared at the same question, displayed in their own languages, perfectly translated, perfectly understood. Can you still see us? The coalition initiated full-spectrum scans of Earth. Surface, orbit, subsurface. Every layer, every frequency, every measurable dimension. The results came back, incomplete. Earth was still there, but not consistently. At one moment, the planet registered as a stable, physical object. Mass, gravity, atmosphere all intact. The next, those readings flickered, as if the planet's presence had shifted slightly out of alignment with observable space. Not gone. Not hidden. Just misaligned. Increase scan resolution, the commander said. Resolution increased. The inconsistencies grew. Sensors began to disagree with each other. Visual confirmation showed a planet. Gravitational readings confirmed its mass. But quantum-level scans returned gaps. Sections where matter should have been, but wasn't measurable in any conventional sense. It was as if Earth existed in more than one state at once. Reconcile data, the commander ordered. The system attempted. Then failed. Unable to establish consistent model. That sentence echoed through the command structure like a fracture spreading through glass. Because if a planet could not be modeled, it could not be predicted. And if it could not be predicted, it could not be controlled. The coalition's entire framework, its dominance, its expansion, its flawless decision-making, was built on one principle. Everything could be calculated. Everything could be known. Humanity had just broken that principle. Across distant systems, fleets began reporting new anomalies. Ships attempting to lock targeting systems onto Earth found their coordinates shifting mid-calculation. Weapons could not acquire a stable solution. Even observation probes, still descending toward the planet, began returning contradictory data. Multiple positions, overlapping timelines, inconsistent distances. One probe reported entering Earth's atmosphere. Another, transmitting the same identifier, reported being millions of kilometers away. Both were correct. Neither could be verified. Defined phenomenon, an analyst requested. There was no answer. Because no existing term applied. This was not stealth. This was not cloaking. This was not defense. This was something else entirely. Humanity had not hidden. They had moved beyond being something that could be fully observed. The realization spread quickly, and with it something far more dangerous than confusion. Fear. Not the kind born from overwhelming or visible threat, but the kind that emerged when the rules themselves no longer applied. When cause no longer led to effect. When observation no longer guaranteed understanding, the coalition attempted to adapt. New models were created, ones that accounted for instability, for uncertainty, for nonlinear behavior. They ran simulations with incomplete data, probabilistic outcomes, flexible parameters. Every model failed. Outcome, indeterminate. Probability, undefined. For the first time in their recorded existence, the coalition could not answer the most basic question. What happens next? Back on the flagship, the commander studied the message still displayed across its systems. Can you still see us? It was no longer a question. It was a demonstration. Because the answer increasingly was no. Earth flickered again on the main display, present, then slightly displaced, then present once more. Not disappearing. Not escaping. Just existing outside the constraints that made it predictable. And if humanity could do that to a planet, what else had they already changed? The next report arrived without warning. Multiple coalition outposts, spread across different sectors, had just lost contact simultaneously. No distress signals. No damage reports. No trace of attack. Just absence. The same kind that had taken the probes. The same kind that now surrounded Earth. And as the commander looked at the expanding list of missing systems, one conclusion became unavoidable. Humanity wasn't just unreachable anymore. They were beginning to reach back. The first fleet didn't realize it was under attack. There were no incoming signatures. No energy spikes. No distortion waves or weapon locks. Every system reported normal function as the formation advanced through a stable transit corridor, one of the last routes still considered reliable. Then one ship vanished. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Gone. Its position marker remained for 0.2 seconds longer than it should have, then blinked out as if it had never been assigned. Internal logs recorded no anomaly. Surrounding vessels detected no disruption. Space itself did not react. Report, the fleet commander demanded. No report came. Because there was nothing to report. Seconds later, a second ship disappeared. This time the fleet halted. Sensors flooded the area, scanning every wavelength, every quantum fluctuation, every conceivable trace of interference. Nothing responded. Nothing reflected. Nothing even suggested an event had occurred. Maintain formation, the commander ordered, though the command carried less certainty than before. A third ship vanished. Closer this time. Close enough that neighboring vessels registered something. Not a signal. Not a force. A distortion, brief and subtle, like reality had folded inward for a fraction of a second and then smoothed itself out again. Retreat vector, the commander began. The fourth ship disappeared before the command finished. Panic did not erupt. It leaked. Across the fleet, responses slowed by fractions of a second. Targeting systems recalculated unnecessarily. Command confirmations took longer than protocol allowed. The cohesion, the perfect, machine-like coordination that defined coalition forces, began to fracture under something far more dangerous than chaos. Uncertainty. Full withdrawal, the commander ordered. The fleet turned. Or tried to. Navigation systems responded with conflicting data. Exit vectors overlapped. Distances stretched and compressed unpredictably. Ships that should have aligned perfectly drifted out of formation by margins too small to correct and too large to ignore. Another vessel vanished. Then two more. Not sequentially. Simultaneously. As if whatever was taking them no longer needed to follow any observable pattern. Across the galaxy, similar reports began to flood in. Outposts lost. Stations gone. Entire defense grids, structures too large to miss, too important to overlook, simply ceased to exist within recorded space. No debris fields. No residual energy. No indication they had ever been there beyond fading historical logs that no longer aligned with present reality. It wasn't destruction. It was removal. And it was accelerating. Quantify losses, the commander demanded. The system hesitated. Unable to establish total count. Estimate. Estimates vary by plus or minus 38%. That was unacceptable. The coalition did not deal in uncertainty margins that large. Yet every attempt to refine the data only made it worse. Records contradicted themselves. Timelines overlapped. Some systems appeared to have been lost hours ago, and simultaneously never existed at all. The deeper they analyzed, the less stable their understanding became. Across distant sectors, civilizations that had once viewed the coalition as an unshakable constant began to withdraw. Trade routes were abandoned. Diplomatic channels went silent. Observers who had once watched humanity out of curiosity now watched the coalition with something closer to alarm, because the balance had shifted, and no one understood how. Back on Earth, if it could still be called that, the resonance intensified. It no longer pulsed beneath the surface. It extended outward. Subtle at first, a distortion at the edge of measurable space. Then stronger. A presence that did not travel, did not expand in any conventional sense but still reached. The suppression field, once absolute, now registered inconsistencies. Gaps. Not failures, not breaches. Just moments where its effect did not apply. Moments where something inside Earth touched beyond it. The commander issued a priority directive. Engage total observational lock. All resources. No variance. Every available system aligned. Every sensor, every probe, every analytic process focused on one objective. Define what is happening. The result came back in fragments. Not because the system was damaged. Because the answer did not fit into a single frame of reference. Earth was not expanding. It was not moving. It was not attacking. It was overlapping. Intersecting with multiple points across space without traveling between them. Appearing where it was not. Affecting systems without proximity. Existing in a way that ignored distance entirely. Define operational capability, the commander said quietly. The system processed longer than usual. Then returned to classification. Non-localized influence. That term had existed only in theory. Until now. Which meant one thing. There was no front line. No boundary. No safe distance. Another fleet report came in, this one from deep within coalition territory. Command, we're losing. The transmission cut. Not interrupted. Erased mid-sentence. And when the system attempted to recover the signal, it found nothing to retrieve. No origin point. No end point. No evidence it had ever been set. The commander stared at the expanding map of uncertainty. Systems fading, routes collapsing, data unraveling. For thousands of years, the coalition had operated under a simple assumption. That control came from understanding. That dominance came from prediction. Humanity had just removed both. And as another cluster of systems blinked out, not destroyed, not conquered, but simply gone, the realization settled in with a weight no calculation could reduce. This was no longer a conflict. It was a collapse of rules. And for the first time, the coalition faced something it had never prepared for. An enemy that didn't need to win battles. Because it was rewriting what a battle even was. They appeared without arriving. Not emerging from transit. Not dropping from concealment. Not even phasing into view in any way that could be measured. One moment, the coalition's core systems were filled with absence. Gaps where fleets and outposts had once existed, and the next, those gaps were occupied. Human vessels. Thousands of them. Positioned across multiple sectors simultaneously, each one holding perfect formation relative to its local environment, as if they had always been there and reality had only just decided to acknowledge it. No travel signatures. No energy displacement. No transition. They simply were. For a moment, no one reacted. Because reaction required understanding, and understanding was no longer available. Confirm visual, the commander ordered. Confirmed. Confirm sensor lock. Partial. That answer carried a new kind of weight. The ships could be seen. They could even be measured. Mass, structure, energy output, all consistent, all real. But they could not be held. Targeting systems locked, then slipped. Coordinates aligned, then drifted by margins too small to correct and too large to ignore. It was like trying to grasp something that existed just outside the frame of certainty. And still the ships did not fire. They did not advance. They did not even signal. They waited. Across the galaxy, observers watched in absolute stillness. Every major civilization, every intelligence network, every entity capable of perception had turned its full attention to this moment. Because whatever happened next would not just determine the outcome of a conflict. It would define the limits of power itself. Then, without warning, a channel opened. Not through the coalition's systems. Not through any known medium. It bypassed every layer of infrastructure and appeared directly within the cognitive interface of every command entity present. No translation required. No delay. A voice. Come. Measured. Human. You expected resistance, it said. The commander did not respond immediately. Not out of hesitation, but because the statement itself carried implications that required processing. Yes, it replied finally. That was the predicted outcome. Pause. Then the voice again. And when we didn't? The question lingered, not as a challenge but as a reflection of something the coalition had failed to account for. You were assessed as neutralized, the commander said. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Neutralized, the voice repeated as if examining the word rather than accepting it. You measured what we could do, not what we would choose to become. Across the displays the human vessels remained perfectly still. Not threatening. Not retreating. Just present. The commander adjusted its internal processes, shifting from confrontation to negotiation, something it had not needed to do in centuries. State your objective, it said. There was no immediate answer. For a fraction of a moment, the silence stretched just enough to create something unfamiliar. Anticipation. Then, we needed you to act first. The statement landed with a weight that did not require explanation, because it reframed everything. The suppression. The silence. The transformation. None of it had been a reaction. It had been a sequence. You allowed this? The commander asked, its voice unchanged but its internal state no longer aligned with certainty. We required a catalyst, the human voice replied. Something absolute. Something that removed hesitation. Around them the human fleet shifted, not in position but in presence. Sensors registered subtle changes not in location but in how the ships interacted with space itself. As if they were no longer aligning to it, but defining it. You sacrificed billions, the commander said. Another pause. This one longer. Heavier. We lost billions, the voice corrected. There's a difference. For the first time, something passed through the coalition's command structure that had no classification. Not fear. Not confusion. Something closer to recognition. Because this was not the behavior of a species seeking survival. This was the behavior of a species that had already decided what survival meant. What do you want? The commander asked. This time the answer came immediately. To finish what you started. Across the galaxy systems flickered. Not failing. Not collapsing. Adjusting. The human vessels pulsed, not with energy, not with force, but with alignment. The same resonance that had been building beneath Earth now extended through them, linking each ship not by signal but by state. And for the first time the coalition understood the scale of what it was facing. This was not a fleet. It was an extension. You cannot maintain this indefinitely, the commander said, grasping for the one remaining constant, limitation. Everything had limits. Everything ended. There was a brief silence. Then the voice returned, softer now. We don't need to. A new display appeared across every system. Not forced. Not projected. Accepted. A structure. Not physical. Not fully conceptual. A framework. Something that defined boundaries, not of space but of possibility. This is the point, the voice continued, where your models stop working. The commander analyzed it instantly, and failed. Because the structure did not operate within measurable parameters. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a defense. It was a rule. You're changing the system, the commander said. Yes. The simplicity of the answer carried more impact than any threat could have. And if we refuse? The commander asked. For the first time, there was something different in the human voice. Not anger. Not aggression. Certainty. You already did. Across the map, more coalition systems vanished. Not gradually. Instantly. And this time there was no attempt to track them. No effort to recover. Because everyone watching understood what it meant. This was not escalation. This was the end of escalation. The line had already been crossed. The only question left was what came after it. And whether the coalition still had a place in whatever humanity was about to define next. For the first time in its recorded existence, the coalition did not issue a command. It waited. Not because it lacked options, but because every option it could calculate no longer guaranteed an outcome. The frameworks that had governed its decisions for millennia, probability, prediction, controlled escalation, had all been rendered incomplete. And in that silence, something unprecedented began to happen. Across the galaxy, systems stabilized. Not fully. Not permanently. But enough to notice. The distortions that had fractured navigation routes began to settle into new patterns. Communication delays did not vanish, but they stopped worsening. The disappearance of fleets and stations slowed, then stopped entirely. Humanity did not press forward. They held. Their ships, still present across multiple sectors, still impossible to fully track, remained in position without advancing, without striking, without issuing further demands. It was not restraint born from weakness. It was restraint chosen from dominance. The message that followed did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, quietly, seamlessly, integrating into every system, every interface, every form of cognition capable of receiving it. Not as a command. Not as a broadcast. As a condition. You built a galaxy on prediction, the human voice said, steady and unforced. On knowing what comes next, and acting before it happens. No one interrupted. Because no one could. That ends now. Across coalition networks, something shifted, not externally but internally. Algorithms designed to forecast outcomes began returning inconsistent results. Long-standing models, refined over thousands of years, started producing divergent possibilities where once there had only been one. Certainty fractured. Not into chaos. Into choice. You decided we were a future threat, the voice continued. So you acted before we became one. Pause. We decided to remove that future. The meaning settled slowly, like gravity reasserting itself after being forgotten. This was not punishment. It was correction. Across distant systems, commanders tested their tools. Predictive engines, probability matrices, strategic forecasts. Each returned something new. Multiple outcomes. Unresolved paths. Variables that could not be collapsed into certainty. The advantage that had defined entire civilizations was gone. You can still choose, the voice said. You just won't know the result before you do. On the flagship, the commander ran its final analysis. Not of humanity, of the galaxy itself. The structure, the rule humanity had introduced, was not localized. It did not target systems or species. It applied universally, threading through every layer of interaction, every decision-making process that relied on prediction. It did not destroy capability. It removed inevitability. And in doing so it changed everything. Why stop? The commander asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine inquiry. There was no delay in the answer. Because this was enough. The simplicity of it carried more weight than annihilation ever could. Humanity had the capability to continue. To erase, to dismantle, to dominate in ways no species could resist. And they chose not to. Across the galaxy, observers began to understand what had just happened. The coalition had not been defeated in battle. It had been forced into a new reality. One where power no longer came from knowing the future, but from facing it without certainty. The human ships began to fade. Not retreating. Not leaving. Simply becoming less necessary. Their presence diminished not in number, but in importance, as the structure they had established stabilized on its own. They were no longer required to enforce it, because it had become part of the system itself. On Earth, the silence finally broke. Not with a broadcast. Not with a declaration. With movement. Satellites reignited. Networks reconnected. Lights returned, not abruptly but gradually, as if the planet itself was choosing to wake rather than being switched back on. Cities came alive again. But something had changed. Not in their structure. In their awareness. Humanity no longer moved with the urgency of survival. It moved with the certainty of understanding what it had become. Across distant worlds, children would grow up in a galaxy where no one could see the future clearly anymore. Where no empire could strike first based on what might happen. Where every decision carried weight, real weight, because its outcome was no longer guaranteed. The coalition adapted. It had no choice. Its models rewrote themselves. Its strategies shifted. Its dominance redefined. Not erased, but no longer absolute. And always, at the edge of every calculation, every decision, every moment of uncertainty, there remained a quiet, unspoken constant. Humanity. Not as a threat. Not as a ruler. But as something far more difficult to categorize. A boundary. A reminder. A species that had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and responded not by conquering the galaxy, but by changing the rules that allowed conquest to exist. Years later, in systems far from Earth, analysts would still study the moment everything shifted. They would replay the silence, the question, the disappearance of certainty itself. And they would arrive at the same conclusion again and again. Humanity had not won because it was stronger. It had won because, when faced with the unknown, it chose to become it.